Time for some more pandemic combat radio sessions here. Today, we got something special coming your way, but you might want to get started with some of this. The book, available on us, 1 year's worth of live broadcast stories and backstage craziness, is available on Amazon. It is literally a pictorial of who's who in the music business. I mean, it goes from the Temptations to Blue Oyster Cult, more cowbell. Air Supply, everyone's favorite, If You're All Out of Love. All the great stories, including epic moments with the members of Oingo Boingo, Nancy Wilson of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the band Heart, Jeff Tate of Queensryche, Berlin. We'll be doing some Zoom sessions with them coming up. Also, Los Lonely Boys, Born on the Bayou. That's the night I actually picked what they opened with backstage. Pretty classic. It's all here, and it's all for a good cause. Amazon, get it. Brigade-Radio-One /Combat Radio. Live at the Canyon, year 1, because year 2 is about to come out, along with a Christmas book on us and our charitable work. More on that later. Also, if you want to hit us up on Patreon, all the content is going through there first in an effort to get people inspired to help us there and help with our work with social services. This shirt, in fact, some other interesting bits of hardware are going to be made available to people who sign up there. And then hopefully from there, the magic will continue into Christmas and our work for social services. So next, coming up, Disney legend Tad Stones. All right, everyone, it's tough not to love this guy. Not only is he one of the better artistic legends, he's actually a hero where our work with social services is concerned. He's at an undisclosed yet disclosed secret location in what looks like a plethora of Disney and animated goodness. Mr. Tad Stones. How are you, Tad?
Hey, good morning, Ethan. I'm good.
Where are you? That's the command center, right?
This is the command center. This is my, it's rough calling it a studio. It's my friend Amy Meberson, who does the Disney Pocket Princesses online, called it my artist nook because it's not much deeper than what you're seeing. It's pretty much the room fits the desk and some bookcases and a printer.
Well, I've been there, and I would say every shelf holds some piece of magic related to either Disney or some element of your creative career. It's pretty. You should give tours there, Tad. Once upon a time, you should probably.
It'd be a very short tour.
It would be a quick tour.
This wall, that wall, that wall.
Right,
we're done.
Right. You're selling yourself short, buddy. I think it'd be a better tour than that. Hey, Tad, we've known each other a long time, but since we're doing sort of a Zoom pandemic session here, maybe we can start with your first day. Give a little backstory on your career. Obviously, the world knows you as the instrument behind things like Darkwing Duck and Rescue Rangers. But walk me through your very first day on the Disney Studio lot and how you got there.
Being that was 40 some years ago, I have no memories of that first day. Basically back then Disney was not the behemoth that it is now. It was, the animated films came out like once every 5 years. And when I came, I think there were only 65 people in the department, not counting the ink and paint ladies, because they still painted cells back then. Obviously, there was no digital stuff. Actually, the 9 old men that, like Supreme Court justices, Walt's 9 old men, the animators who had helped start the studio and certainly the feature division, they were still there for the most part, about 7 out of the 9, I guess. And they fully expected the studio to be shut down after Walt's death, but luckily Jungle Book made enough money that they kept going. And then Roy Disney Sr., who was the one who always said, we don't have to make these anymore. We've got plenty in the vault. He died. Really? Yeah. I mean, he got Epcot Center going, and that's side of Walt's dream. And then Robin Hood came out and made a huge amount of money domestically. It made $6 million, which was huge then for an animated film. So management said, what are you doing to train new animators? And it was like, really? We're supposed to train new ones? Okay, sure. And it was very small. Eric Larson was one of those 9 old, the great animators who animated like Figaro the cat in Pinocchio. He basically took everyone under his wing. They'd look at portfolios as a group. You survive that, you come in. If you don't know anything about animation, Eric would take you through some basics. But then you basically had 4 weeks to turn out a personal test. And if you didn't know anything about animation, that's like, imagine trying to learn the trumpet, and then while you're learning the trumpet, they say, oh yeah, we have a marching event this afternoon. Let's go, let's play this music. Luckily, most of the people had at least some feeling because they had all been fans, so they understood the basics and were Disney fans and all that. So I came in like that. You had 4 weeks to do a test. I survived that, survived the second 4 weeks, and then you're put into production as an in-betweener, which I was so bad at, I almost got fired. So that would have been a very short Disney career. Eventually, I got moved into story. And then I had kind of a tour of the company because out of features, they put me into having me do an educational film. And I did that, which was, edutainment, as they said back then. And then when I finished that, management said, we're doing this thing that blends education and entertainment over at that time it was WED Enterprises, which is now known as Imagineering. And I spent about 2 years, I think, there, working with Ward Kimball on the Transportation Pavilion, meeting George Lucas as we worked on the Space Pavilion, the one that's not there. And then with Tony Baxter, one of the lead designers of Disney parks, working on the Imagination Pavilion, the first version.
Let me stop you right there. You mentioned 3 titans, right? Ward Kimball, George Lucas, and then Tony Baxter. Give me like a 1-word description of each one of those.
I can't get it to. Well, okay. Ward was. Let's put it this way. Ward was like Loki, god of mischief. He still had that personality. He was like working with a time machine because we were working again on this transportation ride, which took you through the history of transportation, just filled with gags. And when you got to a certain point of the first automobiles, and shortly thereafter, Ward was remembering stuff that he saw in his childhood and telling me it real time. I mean, and he told me stories of the studios at that time. It's the one point in my career that I said, I wish I kept a journal. But, my first son was like 3 years old. And it wasn't like I'm going to go home and say, excuse me, boy, I've got to write down my thoughts. Anyway, that's Ward. So he was fantastic to work with. Then with George Lucas, I just got to meet him at the Space Pavilion. My most memorable thing there is at his first meeting, he was just called in as a consultant. And they also, frankly, liked big names that they could hook onto the pavilions for publicity. We had lunch in a conference room. It was fried chicken. And I happened to sit directly across from George. I was possibly the youngest guy. There was one other guy who I was working on the Space Pavilion with, Tim Delaney. He is certainly my age, maybe a touch older, a touch younger, I don't know. But I sat across from George. Everybody else was like playing it too cool for the room. And I just looked at George and said, I'm sorry, all my friends at Feature Animation would kill me if I don't ask you about Star Wars. And George said, yeah, go ahead. And he told me back then, and that's before Epcot was built, this was probably, I should look this up because
hold up, Tad.
Dates, but it was either before New Hope and Empire or Empire and Return of the Jedi. I know it was before that.
When you get the green light to ask him about Star Wars, what is your question?
I God, you know what? I don't remember my question. What I remember the answers of, he told me there were 9 films. And back then, and for a while, later on, he denied it. He said there was only 6 films, and then suddenly it became 9 films again. He also said, nobody will like the first 3 films. Now, it wasn't like,
How right he was.
this is true. Although, kids who grew up with those films have no problem with them. It's their Star Wars. But what he meant is, it's the first 3 were about politics. They were like, where you have the swashbuckling pulp adventure of the middle 3. The first 3, he says, are about how this war came to be, and it's about politics. Now, what I didn't think of then, because I was in awe, was, you're making up the story. If you don't think it's popular, you could make up a slightly different story. That's what script writing's called.
Right. There's an interesting like developmental moment there where you think in terms of project development, maybe you change a few things, George.
Well, I think basically as a creator, he created this world. I mean, as I recall, not that he said them, but as a fan, I soaked up everything I could about Star Wars. He wrote it as one super long script. Really the early rough drafts are pretty huge, and then it's like, oh, you got to cut this out, focus on this, and he showed it to his filmmaker friends who were like, Brian De Palma and Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese. So he had some Spielberg. He had pretty decent input back then. Anyway, he got it down to, yeah, they were his friends before they were all famous. So I think was in his mind. He had created that world. So once you become as rich as he was and building your own studio and not doing things a Hollywood way, it's like doing a painting or a sculpture or anything else. If you've got to create a vision, you're saying, no, I'm gonna tell this story, and the challenge is to make that story so people will like it, and that's.
When I was running around Warner Brothers and I was working for director John Milius, he had in his office a copy of the book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, which he told me to take out and go get recycled. He hated it. But in it, the reason I mention it is a great production breakdown of Star Wars and all of that. The screenings for De Palma where De Palma bashed it. The screenings for Spielberg where Spielberg loved it. And if you're a fan of the movie and the way movies sort of get slammed into production, that chapter is really for anybody who wants to read more about the behind-the-scenes Star Wars sort of politicking. But anyway, I don't want to digress about that. But you would say your meeting with Lucas was interesting.
Oh, I mean, it was certainly fun. I'm sure we talked other stuff there, but the other thing, I remember he came back and Alien had come out. And I remember him making the remark. He said, oh, the movie's great. It totally undoes all the good feelings of space that I did with Star Wars.
Right.
So, just it was so scary and all that. Also, that was when it premiered in downtown Hollywood in the Egyptian Theater. And they had the huge pilot body that's seen in the film, which was life size, which was a giant. And I think one night after the premiere, it was set on fire. And since it was all polyurethane foam, it just melted and scorched the outside of the theater. And George's reaction was like, well, what did they think would happen? It's Hollywood. So,
on Alien, Ron Cobb was the production designer on that, and I think he's pretty open about the influence Star Wars played in all the design work, along with obviously Geiger.
Yeah, they had. Geiger did the Alien stuff. Right. I mean, that was brilliant. Actually, not that brilliant. I mean, it's just smart to say, I'm going to take this artistic sensibility that's so different, and you're only going to design on the Alien stuff. And Ron, you're going to do because you did Dark Star, the movie that kind of had the same dirty space future. I want you to do this more clunky, side of things.
Have you seen Dark Star?
I don't think so. No, wait a minute. I must have way back when. I only saw it once.
It's well, one time is all you need, but it's hard to. I mean, obviously Carpenter went on to be John Carpenter, and he's a complete visionary in his own. And then Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Alien, wrote Dark Star and is in it. But it's hard to believe they shot a lot of it in like a USC dorm hallway. But those production stories are all online someplace.
I mean, George Lucas said that. God, I don't know whether he said it to me or this is just publicity. When he was talking, there's the little alien that's a beach ball, basically, with claws. And he said if he just had gotten like a half dozen packages of plastic vomit and glued it to the ball, it would have made all the difference in the world. It would have actually looked organic. But those are those stories. Anyway, in the Tony Baxter, I was, saw each other every day. We were close friends and traveled down to Florida together. It was Tony and myself and Barry Braverman, who was a designer. And Barry was in charge of the hands-on, and this isn't there anymore, I don't think. I've been back in a long time. But the first version of the Imagination Pavilion had a very kind of Disneyland ride. And then it had Dreamfinder and Figment. And it also had a hands-on place where you could use your imagination to basically do interactive media of different sorts. So Barry was in charge of that, and I helped Tony with the creative. I mean, we all worked on everything, but I basically did a lot of the writing and the conception work of the other stuff. Although we sold it to Kodak, and that's when I was going back to the studio to, in theory, work on Epcot documentaries. And Tony said, boy, you're leaving right at the fun part when you go to make the ride. And what happened then is once they had sold it to Kodak, Imagineering management came down and said, okay, this is way too Disneyland. We need it to be more Epcot. So it was totally re-art directed and became less Victorian and more, sparkly and more white, less color.
Give me like a creative guideline Tony Baxter would sort of extend, like one of his rules to maintain like creative optimism, or what was something like Tony Baxter passed on to you where you said, you know what, I'm going to apply that?
Mostly it's to realize that entertainment is different depending on the media. Mm-hmm. He pointed out that a lot of times they would say about Disneyland, oh, it's design, you walk down Main Street and you get the field of nostalgia, and then you see the big weenie at the end, which is the castle that you go through, and then you get there and you see these other things. And then they would talk about rides like the Pirates of the Caribbean. You see this, the mayor is being dunked in the well while his wife's up above saying, don't tell him. And they want to know where the treasure is. And, she's more concerned about hanging on to the treasure. But the point is, and they'll tell you the story of the ride. But Tony pointed out, that's not how people go on that ride. You can't control what they're looking at. You go there and their head's pivoting practically 360 to take in everything. So I don't know how many times you go through the ride before you actually get the story that they say. So writing for a ride and that experience is different than writing for movies or a TV show or, an ice capade show.
I have to confess, like, I looked at that ride when I go on it. Even to this day, I see it totally differently. Like, I understand they're interrogating a politician, but I just felt these Buccaneers just wanted to torture a politician. Like, they already knew where the treasure was. It was just about torturing this political guy for the hell of it on that particular night when they came ashore. And it's interesting because they've continued to try to make that ride a little bit more politically correct in ways, and we saw the changes. When they reversed now they're chasing food and not the women, and there's now I think there's even they've even changed the auction sequence of that ride.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those things where, and yeah, it's the age the men were who designed those rides. One, by the way, I think you're bringing a little to it about torturing politicians. I don't think that was quite in there. You've got a little backstory of your own going in there.
Well,
but I mean,
I was rooting for the pirates, buddy.
but I mean, look at the auction. They were auctioning off women as slaves, and the guys are just horny, yelling, "We wants the redhead. We wants the," who was the buxom, gorgeous one out there. And some of the others were, none of them were as pretty as the redhead or even close. And it's one of those things, it's funny. They would do, Tony told me this, they would do polls about what kind of ride would you like to see? And he said, in all those polls, nobody said, gee, we'd like to see a pirate ride where they burn a village to the ground and rape and kill. That would be good. Nobody said that. After Pirates, they said, oh, we want something like a Pirates Caribbean, and they designed a Western ride that was basically Pirates Caribbean, but in the Old West. And then, of course, the Haunted Mansion.
It's interesting because 100 yards away from where they're trying to remodel the Pirates of the Caribbean theme to be more palatable, they've reshaped the Haunted Mansion backstory to where they've now got an axe murderer in the attic whose storyline is she's beheaded numerous husbands. So it's like, on one hand, we can infuse a multi-homicidal murder storyline, and I love both attractions. They're incredible in what they've managed to put forth there. But we've got to remove certain aspects of pirates, but we still have just 100 yards away these rather disturbing images of mass murder. Anyway,
there's a whole history of the relationship of sex and violence in America, where when was making fun of sex or that subject matter is more verboten than we want to see Bonnie and Clyde shoot up a bunch of people and then get shot up in a very way. And then you really can't, the whole point is entertainment. If you make something, quote, more PC, it's like, and you're complaining about it, maybe you never had a little daughter who said, what's going on here, Dad? Explain this to me. Do they like them? Or, just, it's kind of hard to defend. We're in the 50s and,
it's terribly difficult to defend. My feeling is maybe a little more consistency on the right or wrong. But, here we go. This is unfortunately a rabbit hole. Once you go down, there's no bottom in sight.
Yeah. Well, after the Imagination Pavilion, I ended up, like I said, the Epcot idea was it was going to open in October of 83, I forget. And they said what they sold to the sponsors of the various pavilions is, you're going to give us this much money for the pavilion and another $1 million for these Epcot documentaries. And then the opening week of Epcot, we will have a special devoted to your pavilion and all your signage and all of that. And I was put in charge of those. And the first thing I did was, I said, I don't think anybody's going to tune in for an hour about the land, or then energy. And then, it's like, what's going on here? And so I revamped them and I pitched 4 shows of future human, future home, future city, future earth. And the idea is that future human is, what can we expect, and talk about all the science fiction concepts of nanotechnology or prosthetic limbs, robotics being infused with a human, cloning, whatever. It was an excuse to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. The future home, and we actually started animating on it because there were animated segments. It was very much like old school Disney. in the Disneyland show. Future Home was about these brand new things, home computers, and how we would use them to design clothes and sorts of things, all of which now is old news. By the time it came out, it would have been old news. Future City, it was just about transportation and energy use and that sort of thing. And I never had to get there, but the fourth one would have been problematic because it's like the challenges of future Earth. And this is before people were talking about climate change, but there was still overpopulation and what that would mean, and how do we, do you knowingly go in and do that 1966 World's Fair bright, big, beautiful tomorrow, or do you actually say, well, here's real challenges? Anywhere they took that, the sponsors were all very happy because now, well, certainly Kodak, who did the Imagination Pavilion, is like there wasn't going to be an hour on the Imagination. But now they could all sponsor each one, and it just made more sense to them. However, management, when they pitched this whole thing, pretty much had their mindset back in the 50s when Walt, the three networks were all, and there were only three then, were all after Walt Disney, the man, to provide programming for him. He was just seen as like, this is the family entertainment guy. He's gonna bring in a bunch. And Walt was able to go into ABC, ironically enough, before he owned it, and say, okay, I will do an hour anthology show. The anthology wheel is going to be named after various lands at Disneyland. The show will be called Disneyland, which, we take for granted that name, but before it existed, it's like, let's go to Detmeyer World,
Yeah, it doesn't have the same ring to it, right? I like Tadville. Tadville works.
Anyway, so they all have that mindset where, oh yeah, we're going to go in and offer this, and the networks are going to fall over themselves. Instead, they pitched it and realized back then, that was back when all new cars came out within 2 weeks, or maybe 3, in September. And every year there was a different model of car, and they made a big deal. A lot of ad bucks went to TV. So the other thing that happened at that time of year was the new television season. All the television shows, the new ones and the ones that were returning, pretty much showed up in a 2-week end of September. It's like the last 2 weeks of September, or somewhere in there. So basically Disney comes in and says, okay, October 1st or 3rd, whatever it was, we're going to, you can have these 1-hour documentaries on this, and it's exciting about our whole world and all that. And the network said, we have our own news departments to do low-rated documentaries that nobody wants to watch. And this will be right in the middle of us promoting the new shows. Thank you, but no thank you. So suddenly, whoops, those projects just dissolved. Now, I got to say, I was in way over my head. The idea that I was going to produce 4 documentaries, I would be, okay, now I got to hire the guy who actually knows how to do the work, and I'm just going to be the creative guy spreading the Disney dust.
How does all this battle experience lead you to something like Darkwing Duck?
Well, basically, following that, there was a project at TV, Donald's 50th anniversary. I consulted on that and got on set, got to meet Dick Van Dyke. That was cool, who was the host of the special. And then I swear there was about a year and a half that they should have fired me. I know what I kind of did during the day, but as far as, I was always there to be consulted and talk about new projects in television. But man, I think the head of TV at the time just thought I was a nice guy to have around. Anyway, then it was time to go back to features. And of course, I had all these, as I moved around the company, I had all these, raises and things. And the feature said, we can't pay you that. We don't have a place for you right now. Or if we bring you in back where you left, that you're making way too much. Now, what saved me from a huge cut is another special project came up, and that is licensing knew they had to be on television to really sell merchandising, because the animated films only came out once every 4 or 5 years. And animation was still the heart of the Disney licensing and merchandising line. So they were pitching a couple of specials, and I was recommended to them. I went over there, met with their writers and their executives, and they said, these are ideas, we need a half-hour special. One we'd like to be about Sport Goofy. He was a character, just all about soccer in Europe, was huge in Europe. Not as having adventures necessarily, but as a licensing thing. And then they'd like to do something with Mickey, or they just need ideas. So I went back and I immediately took animation paper, which was pretty large size, and did color sketches, like 4 or 5 sketches to one big piece of paper in marker, and told the story visually with, captions scrawled underneath of Mickey and the Space Pirates and Sport Goofy. And my thought was, I'll use Scrooge McDuck. And basically the concept was the Huey, Dewey, and Louie were on a soccer team. They needed a trophy, and they found one in the money bin that was all beat up. And Scrooge says, yeah, that's fine. That's worthless. And it turns out, and so it's put out as the trophy, and it turns out it's worth millions or something because it's so rare or whatever. And Scrooge just can't take it back because of nephews and public,
Right.
Anyway, so Goofy had to build this soccer team. And of course the Beagle Boys found out how valuable it was. So they were going to be the opposing soccer team. That was the thing. So I worked up that story. They then put me with guys I knew from animation that were kind of the guys that they said, this team will go on to do Roger Rabbit, which was in development. And those guys had actually done a pencil test, showing how it would work. And those guys all became, Daryl Van Sitters was the director, and he opened up his own studio, Renegade Studios. Mike Giamma was on it, and he was like art director of Frozen 1, Frozen 2. Chris Buck was on the team, and he went on to direct Tarzan and Frozen and Frozen 2, along with others. So it was a great team. They took it, and then it was like, Roger Rabbit went to Richard Williams. It was kind of just put on the shelf for a little bit because they had to work in a live action script. And by then they brought in an outside director. Richard Williams came in to do the animation. Daryl left the company. The other guys went back to features. And then I was like, what am I going to do? There was probably a little gap in there, I'm not sure of, but the world changed. Michael Eisner came. Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg specifically, and Rich Frank, who was in charge of TV. I get a call the week of Michael Eisner's first arriving at Disney, and they said, we know you're on vacation. Can you come to Michael Eisner's house on Sunday to talk about television animation? Because somewhere along the line, the old management said, because of that licensing thing, they said, look into getting into TV animation. And I talked to the guy who was most excited about it. And he said, yeah, we'll cut up the clips. He saw doing Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny's, or Bugs Bunny, the Roadrunner show. And I said, no, all that's being held for the Disney Channel. We're talking about doing new stuff. And the guy just, looked crestfallen. He says, you can't do that. You can't afford that. Because management said they had just gone through a strike. They had won about overseas production. The union wanted to stop it all. It was already being done in the industry. The management said, no, we don't want to get into that. And it's like, but we're allowed to. And he just didn't want to cross that line at all. And in fact, at one point, we even had a meeting at Marvel. It's like we would develop the show, Marvel would do it. Marvel would be like a middleman just because they already had contracts with overseas. So it was crazy. It would be like giving them money for doing nothing. Anyway, Michael Eisner comes to talk about TV animation because of that Sport Goofy thing and Mickey and the Space Pirates. What I skipped over is we had a second meeting 3 weeks later, and I presented 2 full projects where the other writer just had log lines, and he just turned them over. He says, I think I'm done here. Well, they remembered me as being this creative guy. That's why those licensing guys who are at the meeting wanted me there. And that's, 9 months later, I went back to features, but then considered leaving the company, but then got a call from the guys to come over to television animation. I visited, and kind of were already introducing me as if I was going to come over before, when I was just visiting. And Jeffrey called me in his office and said, look, it's not a one-way street, but they could really use you right now. And it turned out to be more suited to me. Whereas I look at my Disney career, and it's like my job changed every year and a half or so. And at TV animation, had the same job, but my show changed every 2 years.
Well, let me.
And that's how I got there. Sorry.
Let me circle the wagons on that real quick. All right. So Eisner arrives from Paramount, and you get a phone call to say, "Can you swing down to his house and explain yourself?" And you say yes, obviously, because
there were 10 other guys there, 9 other guys. It was a group. So it's the licensing guys who said, hey, he's got good input. And I even pitched Mickey and the Space Pirates there. Michael said, this is fantastic, but Mickey's too precious. He's everything. We have to hold that off till we do it. And his feeling about animation was Disney is the top name in animation. TV animation doesn't have to look like feature animation, but it should be the best TV animation.
I agree with that. But let's just get on the pop culture footnotes of this moment here, because it's a historical one, right? In the history of Disney, where the track to Disney TV and Darkwing Duck ultimately go. So you go down there. Now, does Michael Eisner answer his own door? What's the scene like? And what's the hospitality like? Is Eisner good to see you? Does he know who you are? Does he know why you're there?
I was there. I arrived there at the same time as Jim Magon, who we worked closely together. We created the Rescue Rangers together. I went on to do the show. Jim did the notes. He created Tailspin. He was one of the editors of DuckTales, and he, with Art Vitello, created the Gummy Bears. Okay.
So, how's the initial Eisner impression?
We go there. This is how stupid his front of his house, first of all, it was just like a cement driveway, as I recall. And the front of his house was like covered in ivy with just a tiny door. Mm-hmm. That if we weren't like, we're in a different world, we're in an alien place, what is this Bel Air place? It didn't look like a front door. It wasn't imposing. It was like, well, that must be a side door or something. And we start walking around the other side of the house. We ended up, his wife was in the kitchen in a robe with her kids, giving them breakfast. And here's the casual. 2 of us like, well, we weren't supposed to come in through the kitchen door, is what I'm saying.
Oh, you went through the wrong door. Okay, I get you. Yeah. So, good job, Tad.
Okay, yeah. So don't know what impression that made, but I think people were already there. And he came in, and it was just, he was there, and Frank Wells was there. Frank was a little later in coming. Jeffrey wasn't there, Rich Frank. It was the 2 main executives. There was a singing telegram of congratulations that was delivered while we were there. So basically it was very casual in a parlor, whatever you want to call it, a L-shaped couch or something, and a bunch of ottomans and stuff like that. People just talking about animation.
So you show up now. You take your seat, you get comfortable, and Eisner opens up with you by saying, what? How does Tad Stones get on the track here?
I think he was, again, I was there, it wasn't like I was at pre-meetings to knew that this is what the meeting's going to be about, this is it. It was just kind of like, bring any ideas. So I brought some of those sketches that I still had. which now that I think of it, I must have had those at home because I was on vacation. So it's not like I went to the studio, picked up my stuff.
Is that are you allowed to take intellectual property home with you, Tad, while you're on
Most of my
vacation?
stuff, a lot of times back then, I mean, Disney in theory owned every thought I had while I was on
Right.
contract. Um, and a lot of that stuff was done at my house. Um, and it's like, are you supposed to? No, but a lot of times, especially in television animation, I knew that if people don't take this stuff home, it's going to go to a black hole. Nobody's going to know it exists because that's not how the
Yeah.
TV side worked, and it's going to be lost, forever. So, and the other thing was specifically with that project, because it didn't go, we did the Goofy thing instead. It was like, no, I'm keeping that because I'm going to constantly be repitching this or repitch the aliens in a different project or these designs, sort of thing.
So, what happens at the meeting to make you walk away and think there's obviously a moment where you've been given the job in a sense or a job? There isn't that moment at this meeting.
No, quite the opposite. In that they talked about TV animation. Michael started in TV animation at ABC. How important it was, what kind of projects do we want to do? Mickey's off limits. What ideas do people have? And people had some ideas, so it was kind of that general thing, his enthusiasm. He's saying, we're getting behind this. He and Frank Wells. So it was just kind of that. And I'm done. I go back to features, and features was suddenly off the lot and setting up in this warehouse in Glendale. They thought like, we're being treated like crap. They didn't know that, oh no, you're going to get a resurrection. Even management doesn't realize what you guys are going to end up doing. But I went there. I worked. I had a feature I pitched to Jeffrey. Worked on it a long time. I did a half-hour featurette of Mickey, Donald, and Goofy that I pitched to Jeffrey, which was, again, Jeffrey was new enough that back then we didn't always write a script. In fact, usually you didn't write a script. It was done in storyboards. So a storyboard is like your blueprint for the film. So if you're presenting the film, you're telling the entire story. It'll almost take as long as the actual film itself. Jeffrey was not that kind of guy. So it was like, okay, I got it, next. And I had to, I told this in like 5 minutes, and it was like a room full of 4x8 foot storyboard sketches. Anyway, that was one thing. And then I came up with a feature. I did a lot of color artwork on it. It was like a South American thing. Pitched it, and was like, no. It was just a quick, thing. And that's when I thought, man, I put in all this work. It was such a fast decision. It's like, is there a spot for me here? And, I considered leaving, and it was like about 8 or 9 months since that meeting at Michael's house. And I got into my head, because I had been, since working at Epcot, I started going to the World Science Fiction Convention, got friends with a lot of science fiction authors. I thought, if I could equal my salary by freelancing storyboards, and then I could write like short stories to feed my soul at night, kind of thing. And anyway, one day that's been in my head, and Michael Webster, who was then head of the division of not the main head, but I don't know what his title might have been president. I saw him. I said, hey, Michael, how you doing? And he said, oh yeah, we're set it up. We've got a little studio now in Lancashire. And I said, hey, do you use freelancers? And it's like, Michael perked up. He said, well, you don't want to be a freelance storyboard guy. Why don't you come over and visit to us? And I had forgotten that they wanted me over there. They had expressed interest, but it was a passing thing. It was not a solid offer or anything. In fact, I don't think they ever asked me. It was just like, I knew they wanted me because of they invited me to that first meeting. anyway, that's when I went over there and said, he started introducing, yeah, Tad's coming over here. And I am. And I didn't challenge him. It seemed like that would be rude. And then I met with Gary Kreisel, who was the head of television at the time and later became the head of TV animation. And, they made an offer. The offer was way lower than the money they talked. Now, I was used to being thrown around Disney. They could have just said, Tad, we're moving you to TV animation, and not giving me a raise, and I wouldn't even have blinked, because I was that company guy and had term contracts, and you just go where the company needs you. But when that first meeting, they said, people in this position make this amount of money, and it's like, wow, and I mentioned that the manager at Features, he said, well, we can't come anywhere close to that, and then I get the offer, and the offer is like $25,000 a year less than what they had mentioned, so substantially less. And it was still way more than I was making, but it was just that, wait a minute, you offered this, you're doing a bait and switch with me. And that's when and I went to the manager, and this is after Jeffrey had said, it's not a one-way street, we'll see how it works out, they could really use you. And the manager said, you can't come back. I mean, you've talked to Jeffrey already. This is a done deal. It's like, oh, fine. I go over there and I just fit in immediately. And it was a very creative thing. And technically I went over there as an executive, a creative manager, and came up with show ideas. I was supposed to bring in a lot of outside writers. I didn't know any outside writers. I should have been calling agents and getting lists. In retrospect, I know what I was supposed to do, but luckily I didn't do that, because they had a gong show coming up where you just pitch a bunch of quick ideas and they move through them. And we had one coming up, and I think we pitched 22, 23 shows, and 18 of them were mine, just one-liners. And that's, when the third season of Gummy Bears came, NBC didn't want to work with Jim Megan anymore. They had butted heads too much, and Jim had they had eyes on Jim for DuckTales and other shows. So they basically slotted me in, and then by the end of the season, I was not just the story header, I was co-producer. And after that, created Rescue Rangers with Jim, did the show myself. And then for Darkwing, it was Jeffrey Katzenberg just telling me, they love trick names. We love the name 00 Duck. And there had been a DuckTales episode, Launchpad McQuack 00 Duck. And we love that name. It can't be Launchpad, it has to be a new character. And I wasn't excited about it. I pitched like James Bond parody. Jeffrey said, this is just a James Bond parody. He didn't like it either. So we were in sync there. And then afterwards, it kind of loosened up. One of the story editors who I would have used said, boy, the way he looks with this, and he wore a white tuxedo at the time, but still had a cape and a mask and a hat, kind of a small pork pie hat. He kind of looks like a pulp character, and I love the idea of pulp characters. That got me on a different path. Ultimately, we weren't allowed to use the name 00 Duck, because Cubby Broccoli owned all the rights to all the James Bond, Ian Fleming works. And then we had a contest that got him renamed. Somebody came, Alan Burnett, who went on to do Batman at Warner Brothers. He came up with the name Darkwing. I said, that's great. I'm just going to add Duck to it, because one is what's in his head and the other is how silly he is together. And once I got to that point, I was freed to kind of dump most of the spy stuff and really go after the Silver Age of comics. And I got to say, my two high points of my career were Darkwing Duck, and then years later, the Hellboy animated movies I did after I left Disney.
Well, your Hellboy animated work features a good buddy of ours, Doug Jones. We have a lot of love for. But
that's fantastic.
Yeah. Really, it's funny. My wife just saw him again yesterday. We're all on lockdown. See, I still have my mask, but just ran into him at the post office yesterday. So, but to circle back on Darkwing Duck, so you develop the look of the character first, obviously, before any script work is done, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're doing all sorts of conceptual stuff. I mean, I'm known as the creator of Darkwing Duck, and if we were represented by the WGA, there'd be no question about it, because it's very clear, if you write, you've created the character and all that.
Right.
But in truth, I was working with artists like Mike Peraza's a fantastic Disney artist, and he did like locations and mood sketches. Bob Klein was another pitch man who actually did the artwork of a Darkwing pitch to help sell the show. And then, of course, I came up with, a lot of concepts, and certainly the tone of the show. I was headed toward that, directing everybody toward what I wanted in my head. But the Darkwing everybody knows was funneled through me, but I just had a fantastic crew and of writers and artists that brought that thing together.
Do you have a favorite episode?
Not really, though. Actually, the first one is still one of my favorites, which ironically is, I think it's on Disney Plus now. It was never on DVD, and it was called That Sinking Feeling, and really set up the relationships of the characters, and it got fantastic Australian animation. The villain was Professor Moriarty, or just Moriarty, I guess. Anyway, I like the ones that kind of play with the medium. There was one called Comic Book Capers, that you're inside the adventure of the comic, and then you realize when the character's acting weird, it's because of who's writing the comic. And then Darkwing starts writing it himself, but then the papers, fly out the window, or actually it's like his daughter Gosling puts a whole box of detergent in the washer to make a mess downstairs. He leaves and she starts writing the comic and becomes more crazy. Then the next door neighbor starts writing it. And by the end, they're actually running across panel lines of all that. So those are the things I like. We did a Twin Peaks parody. That's a lot of fun. And, I was basically having fun with all the silliness of the Silver Age of comics.
I'm sorry, a coyote just bolted by my door. I was like, what the? Anyway.
As long as he's not coming in, you're good.
Yeah, we're good. At least right now. It's not confrontational yet. So you get the creative process for Darkwing going, and you do obviously you record it. You got the scripts, you record it. But it's in those days in particular, there's a while before you actually see your product materialize. So can you?
Yeah,
it
was about 9 months.
Yeah.
Between shipping it, and literally we were shipping it. We lost a show because I don't think a ship sank, but the shipment was lost.
Wow.
And that's the original artwork in a lot of cases, or a lot of it was copies. So the production team had to go back in and kind of re-Xerox everything and ship it again. Where nowadays it's called shipping, but it's all a digital pipeline that just hit a button.
So the first time you see Darkwing Duck all come together, did you see it on TV, or did you guys have a screening? You had some sort of studio screening?
It was the best of all worlds, because I love seeing pencil tests in animation, because I started in feature animation, and that was some of my favorite parts, is when you send out your animation for a test to come back and you see the animators' drawings and all that. Well, the second thing is that episode went to Australia, and Disney Australia had real animators at it, and they spoke English, so they got all the humor and all the gags, and would add to them. Anyway, I don't know why, but maybe because it was the first thing they had done for us. I don't know. But they sent a full pencil test. So we got to see an entire episode animated with all the life of these rough drawings, with sound and everything. And we showed it to the crew and in a conference room. And remember, at the time, Darkwing was very groundbreaking for Disney, that we were breaking the fourth wall. He got smashed, and I had executives saying, like, well, and this is before the Genie, this is before Roger Rabbit, any of the wild stuff. And he said, well, if Darkwing can survive a safe falling on him, how do you have any jeopardy at the commercial? And I said, because he'll look scared and we'll play scary music. It was just totally arbitrary, and it totally works. I knew that, about the animation. Anyway, we just were laughing uproariously, so much so that the secretary came in from next door, our boss's secretary, saying, "What's going on here?" And because he thought there was a riot or something, and it was like, "Can you please keep it down?" And it's like, okay, sure. Except I'm thinking of, you should be rejoicing that we're having this reaction to it, you know. Anyway, that was the first time seeing it, and it was just so fantastic. They actually, I take it back, Australia had done lots of Winnie the Poohs and did a fantastic job on that. I'm pretty sure that came first. And then with Darkwing, it was just a whole different kind of animation. So that was the last pencil test we got. But, you know, and then the next thing was a finished show in color, which was great too, but didn't have the same life. Australia was heads above, you know, all the other studios.
You know, it's interesting. That's something I learned very early on at Warner Brothers is you can tell you have some idea what your product is based on the energy at the screening room. And it's really, and if you are creating a ruckus and people are running back and forth telling you to keep it down, you've got a winner. But, and I happen to think that there are thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands probably of Darkwing Duck fans who need to be thanking you for the Tad Stones machine. We'll be right back with more Tad right after this. Well, thanks to the pandemic, Tad's convention schedule has been put on hold, but hopefully at some point in the near future, you'll get an opportunity to meet Tad firsthand because he does make the rounds and he's pretty dedicated to that scene. And, you know, there's all kinds of fantastic Tad Stones artwork you might be able to get your hands on. Tad, it's an endless conversation of epic proportions whenever we get together. It may be Disney related, feature film related, or in this case, Darkwing Duck related. So hopefully we can get you back for a part 2 maybe this week. I mean, I see you're not wearing a mask, but I know you're staying
locked into my house. Yeah,
you're staying safe. So you should be available. But what do you got in closing for us?
I think that, you know, obviously you asked me one question. If you ask me, give me your history, it's like it's hard to condense down unless I just give you bullet points, and then people go, well, what did that mean? But I definitely, you know, we got to get together again and we talk about, you know, the later years of Disney and post Disney. You know, the last 10 years of my career actually were outside the Disney, although they called me back for pitch certain shows and things like that.
That'll be part 2 when we circle around to it. But I think it's interesting because you were a survivor who said yourself on multiple occasions you thought you would get fired. So obviously they saw something in what you were able to creatively generate.
Oh, and the other thing we'll do in part 2 is last year, actually, I guess it was 2018, at the end of the year, I went to Russia, and Russia, Darkwing Duck, Rescue Rangers, DuckTales, and I think Ninja Turtles were the first cartoons shown in Russia after the Soviet Union fell. And they had never had cartoon shows before. So with Darkwing Duck, they told me, Tad, we didn't know it was a parody. We just, because we never had superhero comics. We never had science fiction cartoons. It was just this insane view into this other world. Same with Rescue Rangers. They had no series. So when I went, I had people standing in line for 4 hours and everybody had a story. So we'll cover a little bit of that, you know, next time I'm with you.
Well, Tad, we have a lot of love for you. Not only respect for your work, but respect for who you are. We know you quite well from your involvement with our work with social services, and we love you for that. But hopefully the pandemic one day will be behind us and you'll be back on the road in these foreign countries where you get to introduce, or if you haven't already introduced your work, you get to introduce the stories behind your work. And let's do a part 2 soon, buddy. We miss you.
No problem. And I'll get together. Maybe we can do something special for Patreon or GoFundMe's, and, you know, maybe we can get a little more insight in how I draw Darkwing Duck.
Well, anything Tad Stones related is good with us, man. Thank you for everything, brother. We'll see you soon.
All right, Ethan. Good talking to you.
Likewise, man. Bye-bye.
I'm Tad Stones, and this is how I draw Darkwing Duck. Every artist draws a character slightly differently. They can't help it. You don't think you have a style, you've got a style. It's just the way you draw. But ideally, in the production of an animated series, we're all drawing the character the same way with the aid of one of these, a model sheet. The model sheet tells you how to draw the character. It's got poses, sample expressions, and hopefully a lot of the personality of the character. This is also the first piece of artwork that's distributed through the company, so a lot of merchandising and toys get done with these poses, like that one, and this one you've probably seen a zillion times. Anyway, down here is what I want to show you is how to draw his head. You'll see that the basic shape is not a circle, it's this elongated oval, and of course these big wide cheeks on either side. He's also got a pretty long neck, which is not something you usually see because he's got that big old mouth in the way. But one of the most important things is how the beak attaches to the head. See how it comes down right from that oval? I even messed this up. I tend to put the edge of the beak out into the cheeks, and it just looks silly. Anyway, you'll see in this model sheet for his secret identity, Drake Mallard, more expressions that you can use if you envision a mask on it, but also this little shaded portion. Think of that head as more of a shoebox or a loaf of bread. So even though you don't shade it like this and you don't draw these extra lines, remember you're trying to draw a three-dimensional character. Down here on the model sheet is how tall the character is and his proportions. You'll hear someone say, oh, a character is 3.5 heads high, like Darkwing. You basically take that size of the head and you multiply it down. Now you change those proportions and you change the feeling of the character. Like cute characters like Goslin are often 2.5 heads high. I think that's the same for Mickey Mouse. See, she's got this huge head, huge feet, but she's about 2.5, 2.33. Also, you see these poses where it's got a lot of her personality that you've also probably seen in coloring books and whatnot. Anyway, enough of that. Time to draw Darkwing Duck. So, okay, first thing, I start with that oval. Almost every time I draw the character, I'll draw a line down the center which tells you which direction Darkwing is looking. Then Darkwing also has this little eye line, which is pretty low on that oval. And that's how his eyes sit down on it. For interest, I'll often make one eye go down to give him kind of a, dangerous look, we should say. Give him his thick brows. And then what I do is add the mask line next. And I flare it out on the edge because he's got those big cheeks, right? One thing I picked up from European Disney comics, because I just love the look of it, are putting a highlight in the eyes and they shade it under the highlight and leave room for a little bit of color underneath. That's way too fussy to do in an animated series, or at least our series back in 1990 when we were in production. But I just love the look at it. Anyway, very importantly, at the same level, really parallel to that eye line, is the big beak shape. And again, we're going to bring the beak down from the edge of the oval. I'm going to put the cheeks in first. And I bring it down. And then you got to go about to that point to bring in the jaw. And I'll open his mouth a little bit and shade it there. And just connect it for the beak and put now where the edge of the mouth tucks into that cheek. I indicate that. His feathers are a little wilder. And I won't draw that neck in, but I'm kind of visualizing it so I know where to place the turtleneck. That'll do it. And then we do the lapels of his double-breasted suit. And to give it a little dimensionality, I put in the buttons with a double line on one side. And next, I bring down the cape. I often like to fold back the front of his cape. That exposes the magenta lining gives him a really pop of color, which is important to Darkwing. It says something about his personality. Sure, he's a terror that flaps in the night, but he's very flamboyant, and he can't resist that little bit of, hey, look at me. Therefore, the inside of his cape is basically pink. And of course, the hat. You know, I will say it's almost impossible to draw this hat too big. I generally have given up trying to keep it on the page. It goes right off. And then when you're bringing the back of the hat down, make sure those lines connect. Not literally, but that line should swoop across behind his head. I want to make the top of the hat fit that oval again. And we just kind of connect the ends. Now, animators draw rough. The cleanup stage is literally a different artist who makes things neat. But that's him. When I'm doing a piece of artwork now, I'm less concerned with being exactly on model, but kind of giving it my own flair. So I often use a brush pen to do some ink lines. They're pretty fancy. I'm going to speed things up a little bit here so you don't just see me tracing my own drawing. Anyway, I kind of like the thick and thin of these pens. This is a Pentel brush pen, and they do wear out after a little bit, but you've got cartridges to refill, but the brush itself can lose its flexibility. I always take care around the eyes, because that's where you want people to look, right between the eyes. And then it's a matter of doing these interesting thick and thin lines to bring the character to life. And again, to kind of give it some dimensionality. Just suggested that neck. Technically it may be too long, but I like the little bit of white there. And the cape looks cool once you get it inked in. That's pretty much it. That is how I draw Darkwing Duck.